Welcome to the Got Invention Show. I'm your host, Brian Freed, and our guest today is Raymond Van Dyke. He is an intellectual property attorney, and he has some very interesting information for us today. We're going to hear about famous inventors. Raymond, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Brian, for having me here with you today.
Raymond, tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you're going to be talking about today for us.
Okay. My name is Raymond Van Dyke. I'm an intellectual property attorney in the Washington, D.C. area. I come from, Chicago, but I've been in the D.C. area now for about over 20 years or so. So this is my home now.
Very nice. And Raymond, you're going to be talking about famous inventors. Are you an expert in famous inventors? Are you just intrigued by them, a researcher? Tell us a little bit about your research that you've done here.
Okay. Well, I've been an intellectual property attorney for quite some time. And I also like history and things like that. So when I look into the history of these people, you hear about Thomas Edison. Okay, what did he do? Eli Whitney, what did he do? And I looked into the details of this, and there's some compelling stories involved with many of these people. And some of the scenarios I'm going to talk about today are some deals that they were involved in and what happened with those deals or didn't happen, so to speak.
Sounds very interesting. So who are we going to talk about today?
Well, depending on time, we'll talk about Eli Whitney, Thomas Edison when he was a young man, the Bill Gates Microsoft saga. That's interesting. And if we have time, the culprits in the cookie wars, something I personally was involved with.
Okay. Sounds very interesting. So let's get started.
Okay. Well, let me just have an introduction. Intellectual property is the driver of the United States. It's a driver for the world economy. If you look at some of the asset allocations for companies and all that nowadays, roughly 90% of a company's valuation is intellectual property, which is astounding. If you add up all of Google's campuses, all of the equipment that they own, add it all up, it is a tiny fraction of the valuation of Google. So intellectual property was in the minds of our founders. They recognized the value of this, and that America's future included business and intellectual property. This sentiment is best reflected by Abraham Lincoln, who wrote a lot about technology. And he's the only president to have a U.S. patent. To Lincoln, patents added the fuel of interest to the fires of creation. The U.S. patent system has been fanning those flames for almost 250 years, helping inventors, helping inventors and America prosper. Okay.
Okay.
So let's turn to the first
All right,
slide.
Let's see.
Okay, we're going to look at these 4 scenarios, how not to deal with huge success. That's the Eli Whitney story. The successful non-businessman, that's Thomas Edison. Deal or no deal, that's the Bill Gates situation. And Pyrrhic and other victories, that's the cookie wars. Now, how do you not deal with huge success? Okay, slide.
That is the question.
Well, let's look at Eli Whitney. He got one of the first U.S. patents. This is for the cotton engine or cotton gin that's become known. He was a mechanical prodigy. He was born in the Northeast, and he graduated from Columbia, and he was an old man there. He was almost 20. And so anyway, he got his degree, and then he got a teaching position down south, but they reneged on it. But on the way traveling down there, he met one of the the Revolutionary War general's widows, and she was in charge of a plantation, and she invited him to stay with her. So anyway, he went down there, and she said, "Well, maybe you're a prodigy. Why don't you take a look at this?" And what the problem he was set to solve was that the cotton was a crop in the South, but it wasn't much of a crop at all at this time because it was so hard to harvest. You had to separate the seeds from the fibers and everything, and this was extremely laborious. So even though America at this stage was exporting cotton, it was an expensive product. So Eli Whitney was looking at this situation. People, and he thought of a solution. It's pretty much a whirling burr. It collects the fibers and separates the seeds at the same time. Well, he created the device. He was there only about 2 weeks, and he did this, and he had a demo. Well, that demo was the biggest hit in the world because everybody, their eyes lit up because they not only realized, oh my God, we can have more crop. We can start producing a lot more. So suddenly people bought options on crop. It was a viral moment. It spread, and people immediately pirated his device and all that. It was very, very difficult for him to control the situation.
Now, did he have any kind of intellectual property protection or any way to protect his idea?
Well, he had a U.S. patent and everything, but turn to the next slide and we'll discuss that a little bit more. There's his patent. All right. So anyway, okay, it's a little dark here. Okay, but he decided when he started the business best he could, even though this piracy was going on, but he did not want to sell the devices. He only wanted to license them. He wanted a royalty on each. And so again, people planted heavily. He lost control of the situation. He litigated a lot. But he started suing people. Then that was it. It was too much. There was just massive amounts of infringement. So he started suing states directly, and ultimately there was a settlement. But it didn't pay anything near what he all the expenses and everything. And Congress, he got some aid from Congress in 1804, but he went bankrupt because it was just the litigation was just out of control. He never filed another patent. Now he did later on have some success, becoming he created an assembly line for creating guns and things like that. This was he's the Henry Ford with cars. This is Eli Whitney, interchangeable parts, everything up to this point. All guns had to be very individually formed. All the components were crafted to fit together. Eli Whitney came up with a technique for standardization, so to speak.
Now, this cotton gin, when you first mentioned that and what's on the screen now, what is the real purpose? I understand with taking the seeds out, but maybe you can tell the audience what the purpose of the machine is.
Okay, the purpose of the machine was to separate the seeds from the fibers. All right, and it was mostly slave labor at that point. So with Eli Whitney's device, if a person were to use that device, they could do 20 or more times the amount of volume in an hour than it would take them in a day. All right. Okay. And it was just an incredible multiplier of the effort. Again,
so when we look around today, Raymond, what is Eli Whitney's device that kind of started from there, and now I'm sure it's much larger machines and automation? Mm-hmm. What are we doing with the machine that he created? What are we making out of it?
Okay, I imagine that I don't go around looking at modern equipment, but I mean, I can imagine the technology is roughly the same. It's a spinning cylinder with rasps on it, and it captures the fibers. And then they have a sieve where it separates it from the sieves. And
that's how clothes and pillows and everything that you see cotton related came from the cotton gin.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say so. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you for that story.
All right. The next slide.
Yep.
Okay. Again, Invention was transformative to the U.S. It completely filled a pent-up need. All right. It had immediate ramifications, again, for the land. People started buying up land and cultivating it and everything. The early U.S. was a bit lawless. Again, you mentioned with the patent and everything, it is hard for him to get justice. All right. Our court systems were not as robust as they are now, and it was very difficult for him. So again, he got screwed, in other words. Today, some other products nowadays go viral. You lose control of it, you know. But this is an example. He had patent and trade secret protection and everything. But again, it was a simple device. Once someone saw it, they could duplicate it. Yeah, but it took him, an outsider, coming in to look at the situation and make it happen. All right. So what could he have done? Control distribution, maybe. I don't know. But once the cat was out of the bag with him, it was gone. Next slide. Okay. So here we're going to look at Thomas Edison. Okay, next slide. Okay, he was a prolific inventor throughout his life. All right. He was both in perfecting what was out there, the telegraph. It was invented by Alexander Graham Bell. But Bell's devices were not necessarily used. It was Edison's improvements that were used. And electric lights and everything. He didn't invent the first light bulb. There were other people trying to do this. But he created the one that would last the longest. Okay, so he had over 1,000 patents in his lifetime. It's still a record to this day. And he also created many things that were totally new, right? Talking machines, a phonograph. We take these things for granted now. But I mean, in the 1850s or whatever, if you wanted to hear music, you had to have somebody in your house playing the piano or playing a violin or whatever. That's the only way you're going to hear music. Or you go to a concert. Somebody has to use the instruments to make that music. You had no repertoire to call up except for your memory. So Thomas Edison made it possible that people could do this. Next slide. But again, the light bulb is something he's really known for. But again, it was an improvement. But he still, after testing thousands of potential components, he and his team figured it out. Next slide. And again, with the talking machine, this was something, I use a Latin term, sui generis. It was just brand new. Nobody was thinking about this. This was a very primitive device. You could, I think I've seen some of these old devices where it's a drum. And there's a stylus that goes on the drum. And I think it was tin. No, it was wax. I'm sorry, wax. And you deform the wax. And that way, the wax was solidified enough that you could put the stylus back on there later and get the sounds back. It was an incredible device for its time.
What's the date on that patent?
1876.
Wow, look at that history right there.
I mean, but again, it's just amazing. If you just step back and think about some of these things, there was no music freely available at all. And so he made it possible for that. Okay. So in his 20s, we're going to look at a little snapshot of his life. Okay. And in his 20s, he patented an improved stock ticker. All right. The business of America was business, remember? And so he was working for the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company. All right. And he had an idea. He had an invention. And he's thinking to himself, what do I ask for? I want to sell this to the boss. Say, now, what should I ask for? He's thinking to himself, 5,000. So he goes up to the boss, and they're starting negotiating. And Thomas Edison starts to speak what he wants, but he just thought, when the boss asked him, how much do you want for it? And instead of saying 5,000, he said, well, how much are you going to offer? And he said 40,000. So throughout his life, Edison was a deal maker in these ways. He made a lot of money. He lost a lot of money, the DC current and things like that. But he was not a true businessman, but he did have a business mind to some degree, in the sense that he could see where the technology was going. And if you can see where the technology is going, you can head it off at the pass with intellectual property and with market share and things like that.
That's intuitive.
Exactly. He was very good at that. Next slide. Okay, now this is an odd scenario, deal or no deal. Okay. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's, sorry about that. Looks like in the porting to this device, the the objects are overlaying the text. Anyway, let's all go back to 1975, shall we? All right. Gates was at Harvard. And in January of 1975, that popular electronics magazine came out. All right. And it talked about the MITS Altair 8800, which was released in December of 74. And MITS stands for Micro Instrumentation Telemetry Systems. It was the first portable consumer mini computer. It came in a kit form. You had to, and it just blinking lights on the dial there. It's just blinking. You had to know what those blinking lights meant. But Gates thought, this is big. He'd already, when he was in high school, had been tinkering with computers and things like that, primitive things. But actually mainframe, MIDIs and things like that were around then. I actually used computers when I was a child around that time. So anyway, but he saw what the future was going to hold. And we're going to see this. So Gates and Paul Allen go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Altair was located. That's where they were manufacturing these things. And with Allen, they wrote BASIC code. BASIC is a basic computer programming language. So Gates sees the opportunity and relocates himself and everything to go down there. Okay, next slide. Okay. The icons. All right. Let's just look at the technology briefly. Computers require an operating system. All right. We all know that. The early operating systems were on floppy disks. For those of you that remember floppy disks, in the 1970s, it was the standard operating system was what was called CPM, all right, or Control Program for Microcomputer. It was written by Gary Kildall. There he is at the top, and his company was Intergalactic Digital Research. Anyway, but Altair at this time was operating with CPM on these other devices. Next slide. Okay.
The pictures are interesting. I know they're covering some of the words, but you're telling us the words, and the pictures are very interesting to look at.
Yeah, that's why I put them in there. So this, I know it's a tech issue and everything, but I'm going to be getting into this. But we're still in operating systems. Okay. Computers had to have chips to run them. All right. So the first Microsoft product was BASIC, and it was written by Bill Gates and Paul Allen for the Altair. All right. That involved the Intel 8080 processor. It was 8 bits. That was incredibly primitive, but that chip came out in 1974. Remember, chip making was brand new at this time. Microcomputers, these were new concepts at that time. So and a new Intel processor, the 8086 with 16 bits, came out in June of 1978. And this was based on the x86 architecture. This was hugely successful. Okay. And Kildall was able to put CPM on the on that chip, or on the first chip, the 8-bit chip. IBM at this time, all right, they're king of the mainframe, okay, and MIDIs as well, but they had an IBM way of doing things, Big Brother, all right. They were suffering competition in the mini computer industry. Other people were moving into their turf and everything. So they wanted to have dominance in the PC market. Okay. So they formed a skunk works in Boca Raton in 1980. So they're manufacturing the device, the PC. They need software. They need an operating system. So at the time, CPM, they made a trip to Bellevue, Washington to meet with Gates, because they thought Gates had one because he was writing all the code for BASIC and things like that.
Did they know of each other? Did they know of each other before that?
I believe so. Gates was, he was becoming known, but I mean, again, this is a very rarefied environment at this time.
Was Gates the only one that was writing the code?
Well, we'll see that in a minute. Yeah,
Okay.
again, CP/M is out there too, but we're going to get that in a second.
Okay.
At this time, IBM licensed their software, including the interpreters. They went to Gates and they licensed his BASIC and things like that. But Gates said, I'm only going to give you a non-exclusive license. This was gall. I mean, this took gall. But he did it, and IBM had to take it. And but IBM said, hey, we need an operating system too. Gates said, well, I don't have that, but I know a guy who does. So, but the Kildall. Okay, next slide. IBM set up a meeting with Kildall. They arrive at Kildall's house, but he wasn't there. His wife was there, and she was a little bit cagey about this because IBM had standard ways of doing things. They wanted her to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Because they had a skunk works. He wanted to keep this quiet and everything. That DRI could not use any confidential information. Gates, when the IBM came to him, he just signed it. No problem. But Dorothy was a little uncomfortable signing this document, so you got lawyers involved, and no deal. IBM left. Next slide. IBM was unhappy. So Gates said to them, well, hey, I might be able to get you an operating system. So Gates was ready. He signed a contract with IBM on November 6, 1980 for an operating system for this new IBM device. Now, again, there were other operating systems out there, as you mentioned, but they were primitive things. I mentioned that there's a cottage industry out there. The Seattle Computer Products Company, for example, they sold microcomputer motherboards. Now, if you buy a motherboard, the guts of the computer, you got to test it somehow. So you need some kind of operating system to see if it works. So the SCP, Seattle Computer Products, hired Tim Patterson to write an operating system for them. And he called it a quick and dirty operating system, or QDOS. All right, next slide. So Gates contacted SCP and said, hey, I'd like to get the rights for QDOS. Remember, he doesn't have he signed a contract with IBM for an operating system at this point already. So in December 1980, he bought a non-exclusive license for $25,000. And later in July of 81, bought all rights to that operating system for $50,000. And then he licensed their new operating system to IBM as PC-DOS. He retained the right. Again, it's a non-exclusive license. He retained the right to sublicense to other people as MS-DOS, their own product. At that same time, Kildall, the CP/M, offered IBM and others a license, but it was much more expensive than Gates, $240 versus $40. So very quickly, PC-DOS and MS-DOS dominated the market, and CP/M became sidelined. Microsoft established the operating system paradigm, the standard. Next slide. IBM became, as we all know, the IBM PC came out, and it was a huge success at the time. It was IBM. They set the standard with the machine. All clones became based on them. They had an open spec on that. Kildall said, hey, you're using my operating system. But he didn't do anything about it. IBM realized their mistake with Microsoft at this point, because MS-DOS was becoming the standard for all clones, including Compaq and others. And IBM was losing market share in South America and other places. Okay, next slide.
What year was that around, Raymond?
This is the early 80s, 81, 82. So IBM later on attempted to cure this problem with Bill Gates. We're going to reset the operating standard. We're going to have OS2 for our new PS2, their new machine. So, but who's writing this code for IBM? Bill Gates, so Microsoft. Anyway, but starting in 1985, they had a joint development agreement, and OS releases came out in 87, 88. But then Windows came out 3.0 in 1990, a graphic user interface, and that changed everything. So the IBM relationship with Microsoft unraveled. And OS2 became more and more sidelined. It became an add-on, and it was expensive, and this, that, and the other, and it's soon gone. Next slide. So the aftermath, deal or no deal. IBM was impatient. Kildall lost out because of his delay and absence in the deal. And his later offer was unacceptable. So let's look at Gates. He wasn't afraid of IBM. He took the initiative in the situation, saw the advantage in Kildall's mistake, got his own operating system, negotiated even though he did not own it. Right? He kept control of his own code with non-exclusive licenses, leveraged everything for the company and everything. He's a visionary, very similar to Steve Jobs. I mean, he's a bit wacky, but still, so was Steve Jobs. Next slide. From IBM's perspective, their due diligence and vision was lacking, just like Xerox. Everything with Xerox, everything with Apple came from Xerox PARC. So, I mean, they had the vision too, but the suits in New York could not see what the value and what they were doing. They couldn't see past the printers. IBM couldn't see past control of the hardware. Gates kept control of his intellectual property. And IBM preferred just to farm it out. They thought controlling the machine was enough. That was good enough. But Gates was a skilled engineer, and he saw the value. Next slide. Okay. We're at 27 minutes. Should just continue.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about Pyrrhic and other victories. All right. Next slide. This one I was involved with. Okay. As a young attorney. Procter & Gamble company, we all know, they have enormous product line and all that, but they wanted to get into the cookie business, okay, with the ready-to-eat cookies, with Duncan Hines cookies that has soft inside and crunchy outside. It has a good mouth texture, okay? So immediate and intense competition it came about. And there was a lot of corporate espionage and everything that came out in the litigation later. Next slide. Now, at this time, there were some upstarts coming out there. They were getting a little bit of market share, not much, but a little bit of market share and notoriety. Mrs. Fields in California, she focused on airports and shopping malls and things like that. Famous Amos in LA, he was a talent agent. He signed Simon and Garfunkel and many other talent, but he loved his cookies.
Me too.
So anyway, there's so clearly there is a need. There's a desire for these cookies. So Procter & Gamble thought Duncan Hines can satisfy that desire. Next slide. So they went to trial. Okay. The defendants in this litigation, Procter & Gamble versus Nabisco brands, Frito-Lay, and those naughty Keebler elves. The competing products included Nabisco's Almost Home, Keebler's Soft Batch, and Frito-Lay's Grandma's Rich and Chewy. All right. Procter & Gamble in June of '84 got a patent on the process for making the cookies. All right. And they filed a lawsuit the day it became a patent. Next slide. Now, during that, as a young attorney, I was involved in some of the discovery for this. In the discovery, there was really revealed Nabisco had some skullduggery going on. They entered into a Duncan Hines bakery, peeking over the transom, trying to figure out how the process worked and things like that. And then when somebody ran out to confront them, there was an inconspicuous white Lincoln Town car going down the Chicago alley, going away. Keebler flew a plane over the Duncan Hines manufacturing plant. This is classic trade secret misappropriation.
Yeah.
All right. And various parties, Frito-Lay, I think it was, opposed as a Procter & Gamble person to attend a meeting. And so all kinds of this trade secret, inappropriate actions, all this was part of the evidence. Next slide. So Duncan Hines, again, was P&G's entry into the cookie business, right? They're their toe into that. They were all in the cleaner. They're in many sectors, but they wanted to get that toe into the cookie business. It was a hard-fought battle, patent issues, unfair competition, trade secret, all this. It geared up for trial in December of 1989. I was a summer associate there, and so I knew of this. But I was in law school in December of 89. But anyway, there were 200 witnesses, 120,000 pages of testimony. Wow. And everything, which sounds like a lot, but nowadays that's nothing. So it's settled on the courthouse steps. And you can imagine as the attorneys, they're gearing up for this. They're ready to address the court, jury selection, all this, and it settles. Yeah, this happens quite a bit. But I mean, it was an incredible thing. But next slide. So consent judgment was reached in September of 1989, signed by Longobardi. P&G's patent was valid and enforceable. No future infringement by defendants. That's key. There was no royalty stream coming in. This is a settlement. All right, $125 million to settle it. The largest at the time. And there's the breakdown there, but each of them had to pay a chunk of that. Next slide. So it was a Pyrrhic victory. All right. Again, P&G wanted to get into the cookie business, but they could not. Because around the time of the settlement, there were years that was going on. Their market share, all the battles out there and everything, it took its toll on the Duncan Hines. They lost market share in the competition. Nabisco's Chips Ahoy was a big winner in all of this. P&G, this litigation effectively got P&G out of the cookie business. They're a dominant company. They're a solid company. They're great people and everything. I spent a summer in a warehouse in Cincinnati going through documents for P&G. So I mean, I have the highest regard for them. But this was their attempt to get into the cookie business, and they got, outmaneuvered, so to speak, in this. So next slide. Anyway, that's it. All right. But I hope it was enjoyable. And,
it was. It's always good to learn a lesson, right? Or lessons and the history of where things come from. I've had the opportunity recently to speak to and interview the inventor of the cell phone, Marty Cooper, on Got Invention show. And he was also on National Inventor Club. So look, you're doing amazing work to be able to share the stories. This is how history continues and advances. And kind of, for me, when I look at these things and how they started, I look at it almost from a perspective of where it originated and how it's kind of where it is today and how I can make it better. That's just the way I just keep it going, because it started somewhere. And that's most of it, right, Raymond? You're seeing inventions all the time come to you as an intellectual property attorney. So you probably see this all the time.
Well, yeah, I have clients who come to me with new ideas, and it's fascinating. I mean, I'll never forget when I was a young attorney, at the same time, I was working on two patent matters. One was this complicated satellite transmission system, was beaming signals into space, and it was really cutting edge at the time. And the other was this insole for a shoe. All right, you put a little insole in there to lift up the person for just a fraction and all that. You can imagine which one was more valuable. The insole. Like what happened with the patent on the complicated satellite system was there was other stuff out there that knocked it out. That patent was gone. All right. Whereas the shoe, it became a patent. It became valuable. They licensed it. So when I was a young attorney, I determined I will never make a value judgment on a client's patent, because who the heck am I? Right. And these things it can turn around. Every client's patent is $1 million, $10 million, whatever, And some of these things I'm working on, I mean, if it goes viral, it could be billions of dollars possibly.
That's right. Well, to do your due diligence and go through the research and development like any business, and that's the way I like to talk about inventions and ideas as a business, because you're putting your time, money, energy, effort into it. and what kind of return are you going to get? Or is it something that you want to just have a patent to hang up on the wall? So these are the things that you have to evaluate as you're working on an idea and intellectual property. Now, Raymond, you've been in law for how long? Intellectual property?
Well, I've been practicing for 32 years.
So I'm sure that you have some words of wisdom to the audience. There's people listening and watching. They're at all stages of their invention. Maybe they came up with an idea at some point and they're intrigued by this presentation of learning about some of the famous inventions, or inventors. But at some point they're coming up with an idea, or maybe they're already there and they have a patent and they're not sure what the next steps, all different stages. So from your experience of 30 plus years, Raymond, share with us some words of wisdom of what it takes and what you've seen to be as a successful invention, and also to keep our ideas moving forward.
Okay. Well, at the start, when you get the idea, do not disseminate it or publicize it before you file for a patent, because otherwise your baby will be gone, because you cannot disclose it and then patent. There are exceptions and everything, but I mean, that is a key thing. Now, later on, when you get the patent, remember that the patent is someone described it as a ticket to another show, and it is, because it enters enforceability at that point, and you can take that adversarially against somebody. Up until then, during the prosecution of the case, from filing to issuance, that is it's a prospective. You may get it and things like that. But the day it issues, like with the Procter & Gamble, you can sue for the exclusive rights that you have as a patentee. Now, some other with the licensing and things like that. One of my other functions is I'm the Greater Washington, D.C. chapter chair for the Licensing Executive Society. You can license your invention out there. We saw what Bill Gates did. He maintained control. Now, you may not be able to do that, but just keep in mind what he did, and look where he is. And but there's a variety of ways to approach things with the intellectual properties. It's not just patent. It's if you're an artist and things like that, it's copyright. And there's also branding and other aspects, and trade secrets. Trade secrets can be leveraged as well, but they have to be maintained as secrets.
Okay, well, that's a very good lesson. And maybe one time or another, maybe you'll be on again, Raymond, talking about somebody that's watching this and coming up with an invention and they turn into a famous inventor. So thank you for doing what you do with the history of famous inventions, and appreciate you being on Got Invention Show. Thank you so much, Raymond.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Thank you. And we'll see you again soon, and you'll come back with some more inventors.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. That was very interesting. We have to know where these ideas come from. They came from somewhere, and think about all the evolution of where ideas start and where they are today and how much more they could actually advance. Thank you for joining us on Got Invention Show. We hope to see you as the next famous inventor that Raymond interviews. Thank you, and see you soon.